Hello again, and welcome to another episode of Human Rights Magazine. This episode is part of a series I am calling Pathways to Peace, in which I will speak with people who have been deeply engaged in working for peace in its various aspects. My guest today is Marie Denis, who has worked for several years with Pax Christi International, the Catholic peace movement. She is the author of several books on peace and nonviolence. Marie was also the close friend of Diana Ortiz, the American Catholic religious sister who suffered horrible torture by government agents in Guatemala in the 1980s. Following a long period of recovery, she devoted herself to peace activism until her death in April this year. My own reflections on the life of Diana Ortiz were the motivation for this series of discussions. I asked Marie to share some of her reflections on Diana's life and her response to violence, how it had affected her own understanding of what we mean by violence, and how we can effectively respond.
It is really interesting and a powerful reflection, I think, to look at and really sit with Diana's experience, how it affected her, and how she used that experience throughout the rest of her life. When she was abducted and tortured in Guatemala, obviously it was right in the middle of some of the most violent years in Guatemala, in El Salvador, in the region. And I think for me, on the one hand, to remember those years, to reflect on those years, has been a reflection on violence, the consequences of violence, the ways that we justify violence or not. My sense is that out of Diana's long journey, courageous struggle, amazing work, founding the TASC, the Torture Abolition and Survivor Support Coalition, doing phenomenal educational work, and on, that out of that struggle, I was absolutely confirmed in a commitment to nonviolence that I was not so sure about during the violence and wars in Central America, because it seemed to me that the resistance to oppression in countries like El Salvador and Guatemala, or the victory over dictatorship in Nicaragua in the 70s, seemed to be examples of struggles that would fit with what might be called a just war. And I always felt that it was very easy for me, who, though I lived in, violent neighborhoods, I'm fundamentally safe in my own life and my own journey. I always thought it was presumptuous of me to insist that everyone should be pacifist, should be completely committed to nonviolence in every circumstance. My experience with Diana, and a lot of work since sort of in the years of living with her, has convinced me more and more. And I have heard from people who themselves have been so hurt by violence that if we are ever going to really establish a more peaceful world, more peaceful communities, more peaceful cities, that the only way to do that is both by learning what violence is, by understanding the consequences of violence, and by committing to nonviolence. So I could say a lot more about that, but I think that it's sort of out of my experience with Diana, I just believe that her experience points so decidedly in the need to shift our world, our thinking, even our struggles for justice and our struggles against oppression to a place where they can be accomplished because we have built our capacity to struggle without perpetuating cycles of violence.
Can you comment a little bit about your own role in that engagement and the engagement of Pax Christi in responding to these challenges?
I think we have a lot of hard work to do. So I think to begin with, we need to understand what is violence much more deeply than we have. I mean, Galtung and others for decades have been trying to teach us that violence is, yes, it's direct violence, but it's also cultural and structural and on, systemic. So I think we need to recognize, we need to put a name on violence wherever we see it. So we need to think about poverty as violence, exclusion and marginalization as violence, racism as violence, and on and on. That's one thing. Second thing that I think we need to do is we need to work much harder at understanding nonviolence. Not nonviolence as the same as pacifism. I differentiate between nonviolence and pacifism because I think that nonviolence, I believe, is a spirituality for many people. It's a way of life for many people. But it is also potentially an effective global ethic. And it is also a broad array of approaches and strategies that we need to use to push back the structural and systemic violence in our world, push back on oppression, to push back on deep injustice, and so on. So in that sense, I think we have to invest in both learning nonviolence ourselves, and that takes hard work, but also in developing, deepening the nonviolent tools that we could be using to address injustice and oppression. So for me, the image that's very clear is as a US citizen, I'm super conscious of the fact that the US is spending now about $750 billion a year on preparations for war, all kinds of preparations for war. So the toolbox of armed and military and violent tools is full to the brim, robust, with well-trained personnel, all kinds of weapon systems that respond to any imaginable threat. Whereas on the other hand, when we look at the investment in developing nonviolent tools, there's very little, relatively none. So what we've been arguing for the last number of years is where can we find the wisdom and the financial resources and the human intelligence to invest in building nonviolent capacity, everything from diplomacy for sure and negotiation and so on, but also in trauma-informed aid, in trauma, dealing with trauma in our schools and universities all over the world, in restorative justice practices, in unarmed civilian protection practices, in a whole slew of ways that we might build human security, build a real commitment to what actually makes us feel secure, which is a roof over our head and food on the table and, healthcare and education and so on. So I think that in order to be serious about using nonviolent approaches in responding to oppression, terrible injustice, violence, threats, and so on, we have to make a major investment of time and all kinds of resources in understanding nonviolence, in strengthening it, in doing, for example, the research to know what is most likely to work when and where. So the research that, for example, Erica Chenoweth at Harvard and Maria Stephan, who was at the U.S. Institute of Peace until recently, have been doing on, for example, when is it effective for external actors to invest or support a nonviolent civil resistance action like what's happening in Burma, Myanmar right now? When is it effective? When does it do more harm than good? What should that aid look like? And on and on. We've done almost so. I want every university in the world to have graduate students doing research on what kind of unarmed civilian protection works under what circumstances, or at the level of school discipline in Washington, D.C., and in the city where I live. What do we know about what will decrease the level of violence in our city? We have a huge increase in the murder rate in Washington, D.C. in the last year. What's happening? How do we get at that? Why is that happening? So I guess my simple answer is we have a lot of work to do to make it possible to not run from conflict, to not avoid the struggle against oppression or injustice, but to learn ways to engage it effectively and nonviolently.
If we're to set aside violence as a response to violence, and yet continue on a struggle, on a journey toward a more peaceful dynamic in the world, how do we do that?
After 9/11, we, and most particularly Pax Christi International, Pax Christi US to some extent, began to ask, why is it that our only response to even an egregious attack like that of 9/11 is military action? Why is it that we lack the creative imagination to treat it as a criminal act and deal with it in the court system and so on? So we began to have some pretty interesting dialogue with Pax Christi International is a network of about 120 member organizations all over the world, many of which are located in zones of war and conflict, whether in looking at violences in the United States or Europe, or in Colombia or the Philippines, or wherever else. So we began a pretty active dialogue to try to understand. Pax Christi always had a commitment to nonviolence, but there was a tendency to think of it as a personal commitment to nonviolence, that this is who I am and how I interact with people. We began to ask our members, Pax Christi members, particularly in war zones of conflict, why do you have a commitment to nonviolence? How do you practice it? How does it connect with your faith tradition? So we decided that the one sort of point of access that we might actually be able to make use of was that we're a Catholic organization. So the Catholic Church has a network of religious congregations, universities, dioceses, parishes, a diplomatic identity in almost every country in the world, presence at the international entities, the UN, the EU, and so on. So we decided that we were going to try to convince the Catholic Church institutionally to shift literally from a focus on the just war tradition, is this war just, to embracing nonviolence as a fundamental gospel value that is reflected in the life of Jesus, but became over the centuries something that individuals might adopt, but wasn't considered to be a practical framework for protecting people in a given country or dealing with political violence. And so in about 5 years ago, we began a process of dialogue with the Vatican called the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative that grew out of, we talked what was then the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace into co-sponsoring a conference with Pax Christi International on nonviolence and just peace. To that conference, there were about 85 people, and probably maybe half were from every war zone we could name where we had a connection. Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Palestine, Lebanon, Sudan and South Sudan, Uganda, South Africa, Colombia, the Philippines, Sri Lanka, and on and on. So we had gathered people who had an understanding of nonviolence, but were living in very difficult circumstances. And we asked them, is this foolish? What if the church actually taught the skills of nonviolence using all of the capacity that the institutional church has? And what the answer that we got, which wasn't unexpected, but it was very clear, was war is killing us. It's been interesting to see Pope Francis in Mosul and Karakosh and Erbil this week, talking with the Dominican sisters, for example, from Mosul. One of the Dominican sisters, I had been to Iraq and met with them as part of a little delegation to Iraq with Pax Christi some years ago. So one of the Dominican sisters was with us at this conference in Rome. And I honestly did not know what she was going to say. This was 2 years after ISIS had obliterated their community. If there was ever a time that defensive military action would be justified and understandable, it was that. And what she said was, it never ends. That we keep pouring more violence onto violence onto violence. Can't we find another way to deal with the conflict? She said, we lived together with people of many different faith traditions for centuries, literally. Now it's a mess, and it came out of a militarized response to a particular situation. So the last about 10 years of my life have been a very intense experience of coming to understand nonviolence in a way that I did not in the 80s. One part of that has been, we've published 2 books. For one of the books, we convened roundtables of people from all over the world, which we did virtually before we had all gotten so expert on Zoom, where we looked at a theology, a sort of systematic theology of nonviolence, scriptural exegesis of nonviolence, a new moral framework. What could the church say? What would be a word that the church could speak in the political arena, at the UN, to national governments, at a local level? If it's not going to focus on the just war tradition, how can it frame the advice, sort of ethical and moral advice that it might give? What are examples of effective nonviolent action? So we sort of did this pretty big process, and then went back to another conference with the Vatican and published it in a book. But in the course of doing that, the piece of the roundtable that I worked on most was on this: what's the new moral framework if we are going to put aside the just war tradition? What are we suggesting? I really believe that we as a world have to move in this direction, and that if we do, we actually can accomplish some of the really deep changes that we need to see happen.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Human Rights Magazine. The podcast is brought to you by the Upstream Journal. I invite you to consider supporting the program and the magazine with a contribution through PayPal as you explore other episodes. Thank you for listening to this episode of Human Rights Magazine. The podcast is brought to you by the Upstream Journal. I invite you to consider supporting the program and the magazine with a contribution through PayPal as you explore other episodes.